Consulting firm Wildermuth and Associates present their cases in the MRT debate. The program is introduced by Chang Hing-Wing.
Good evening. The question whether Singapore should build an MRT system is before us. The magnitude of this question goes beyond whether we would like to ride in an air-conditioned underground train or not. The cost is extremely high, and the money will have to come out of the pockets of the Singaporeans. The point is whether our population growth and travel patterns in the future demand a mass transit system. And if we do, is the system of underground rail in the city center and elevated tracks in the outskirts the best solution to adopt? Or is there a workable, perhaps cheaper alternative? Investigations on the MRT goes back to 1967 when the state and city planning studies were done. In the long-term concept plan for our development, it found that even if the bus system was significantly improved, it would not be able to cope with the needs by 1992. A rail-based MRT system was recommended to back up the buses. In a series of mass transit studies that were commissioned, Wildermuth and Associates, an American transport planning consultant firm, and a group of Singapore government planners wanted to find out if the rail-based MRT system was in fact better than an all-bus system. Three alternatives were laid out. Firstly, an improved all-bus system running on ordinary roads. Secondly, a rail-based MRT system complemented by the buses. And thirdly, a special all-bus system operating on underground or elevated roads specially reserved for these buses. Of the three, the MRT system was found to have the best cost-benefit ratio. A second mass transit study on the technical and financial aspects concluded that the full system would cost $1.75 billion in 1975, but the World Bank, which reviewed these Phase 2 findings, estimated that the cost would be 30% higher. The differences in the price estimates and other doubts which arose led in 1976 to a further study called the Land Use and Transportation Planning Review. The review concluded that the bus system would not be able to cope when employment in the CBD reaches 290,000 people in the year 1992. After that, a high-capacity mass rapid transit system will be needed. Now, one possibility that was considered was to restrict development in the CBD, but this study recommended against it. By 1976, 9 years after the MRT idea was first mooted, careful studies were still being carried out because of the size and the impact that such a major project would have. In the same year, 1976, Mr. Ong Teng Cheong, the then Minister of State for Communications, chaired a committee to study the requirements for an MRT. It considered the possibility of holding down the number of people in the CBD by controlling employment. But in the end, the Ong Teng Cheong report found that the MRT would still be needed by the late 80s. Since 1976, 3 more studies were carried out to review the options. The Scott study drew up a consolidated land use and transport policy for Singapore and recommended preliminary engineering studies on the MRT to try and get a precise and final definition of the MRT routes. A Ministry of Defence study carried out in 1978 considered the possibility of building a second CBD in Tanjong Rhu to relieve the congestion in the present central area. But the MINDEF team predicted that even with Tanjong Rhu, the buses would not be able to solve the traffic congestion by the year 2003. The current Phase 3 mass transit study, being done by a consortium of consultants and staff from the Public Works Department, are trying to determine the engineering designs, the routes, and the costs of the system. In 1979, the estimated cost was $4 billion for a rail-based MRT system. So far, all studies seem to point to the necessity of an MRT system to solve the transportation problems of Singapore. But into all this has come an MRT review team invited by Dr. Goh Keng Swee to re-examine whether there are, in fact, other options. Kenneth Hansen and his team from Harvard think there is. Robert Hubbard and Wildermuth and Associates think not. Tonight, we present Kenneth Hansen and Professor John Kain, representing the MRT review team, and Robert Hubbard and Bruno Wildermuth of Wildermuth and Associates in the MRT debate.
Good evening. Tonight we are here to try to understand what I believe a very complex problem, and that is what would be the best choice for Singapore and Singaporeans in the way of public transportation system. On the one hand, we have an all-bus system. On the other hand, we have a bus-cum-train system, and we also have a whole range of systems in between. When I first thought about the public transportation system, I thought it would be a matter of engineering study or computer calculation. But as I have been listening to more debates, more discussions, and I've been reading more reports, I realized that the issue is not just engineering or mathematics. It is also a question of judgment. I also feel that tonight, since we are talking about judgment, we would try to see whether we can bring to you some idea as to how any system or all the system would affect you as the user of public transportation. Somewhere along the line, we also have to keep in mind that should we make any choice in the public transportation system, how is it going to affect the future development of the city? And also, in the end, we also should not forget about its impact on the users of motor cars. So this evening, we have the two consulting teams here to introduce to us the subject matter. On my right, we start with Mr. Kenneth Hansen, who is the project director of the MRT review team. He also has been an official in the US government and currently consultant to various international organizations and governments on economic issues and urban transportation problems. Next to him is Professor John Kain, who has been the principal investigator on the MRT review team. Among his other positions, he also is a chairman of the Department of City and Regional Planning in the Kennedy School of the Harvard University. On my left-hand side, we have Mr. Robert Hubbard, who is the Senior Executive Vice President of the Wilbur Smith and Associates from the United States. Next to him, Bruno Wildermuth is the Director of the Systems Analyst Division of the Wilbur Smith and Associates. Mr. Wildermuth was resident in Singapore between 1972 and 76 for the mass transit studies. Next, I would like to introduce the various members on the panels. Starting on my right is Mr. Milton Tan, who is the President of the Automobile Association of Singapore. Next to him is Mr. Ma Bao Tan, Assistant General Manager of the Singapore Bus Service. Then we have Professor Bill Lim, Dean of the Faculty of Architecture and Building Science in the National University of Singapore. On my left, we have Mr. Toh Tian Se, Assistant News Editor of the Straits Times. Next to him, Mr. Wong Nanjiang, the General Manager of the Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation. And finally, we have Mr. Joseph Yi, who is the Senior Executive Engineer in the Roads branch of the Public Works Department. I would like to start the discussion by asking the MRT review team to present their views on this subject matter. I hope that in the process they would also touch on a few questions, such as why they think that an all-bus system would work for Singapore. What do they see are the shortcomings, if any, of the bus rail system? And particularly, I would like to know what are the main features of their proposed all-bus system. So, Ken?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When I first discussed the urban transport problem of Singapore with First Deputy Prime Minister Dr. Goh earlier this year, he said, in effect, for the past 5 or more years, we have been told that we have no alternative but to build a large, expensive rail MRT system as soon as feasible, and we're told by many others that it is inevitable. Or else we face the prospect of hopeless urban congestion in the decades ahead. And he asked, essentially, is this true? Or do we have a lot more time with the existing bus system? Or are there alternative systems or less costly systems or a different strategy to provide good, convenient, reliable urban transportation for Singapore in the year ahead, in the years ahead? We've now presented our report to the Cabinet with regard to these questions and others. And discussions are continuing within the government at all levels and with the press and various public forums. This process is being continued, and this distinguished forum tonight is a continuation of that. Now, our findings are quite clear. First, we believe we have established the fact that Singapore does not face a near-term doomsday situation regarding public transportation, which requires the previously proposed extensive Phase 2, Phase 3 rail MRT. In other words, Singapore will not and need not choke on its own traffic in 1992, which is the focus of a lot of our technical studies. Second, we have urged, however, that the existing bus system be vastly improved by stages and in concert with freeway construction and regulation, some extension of restraint on automobile use, and numerous traffic and engineering measures, which obviously have to be determined by operational studies by the officials concerned and with other consultants, I'm sure. Third, we believe that these improvements in the bus system should be directed toward establishing a high-performance express bus system of the type that we have basically described in our final report, the principles of which we have described, which we also assert will prove feasible to accommodate projected peak hour commuting requirements to the central area for 1992 and beyond, and moreover substantially improve all island public transportation so that all citizens of Singapore will benefit from their investments in public transportation. We remind you that 75% of trips made by Singaporeans in the decades ahead will be by bus, even if you build a rail MRT. Now, fourth, we compared this high-performance express bus systems with the various all-bus proposals of previous studies. These studies led to the earlier recommendation, as you know, that a rail MRT was required at an early date and that the economic benefits of such investments would be greater than the economic costs. We found these earlier comparisons to be deficient in the various ways we point out in our report. not certainly in all respects at all, but substantially that the all-bus systems compared, we did not believe were the optimal systems to compare, and secondly, that the proposed phase 2, phase 3 MRT appeared on the basis of that analysis to be a marginal investment for Singapore. Now, consistent with our assignment, we have also analyzed alternative rail MRT systems, and we have compared those to the proposed larger phase 3 MRT. We have identified a number of different elevated and underground limited rail systems which would perform the essential function of central area commuting completely satisfactorily. I would stress that these are options that were not, in fact, perceived before and evaluated before in this manner. This is the matrix by which we look at these, and fundamentally, as you will see, we have on this line an improvement of the existing bus system, which we say should be done in any event. Everybody's been somewhat waiting for the miracle of a mass transit system to happen, and this progress is not going fast enough for Singapore's benefit. We suggest that that measure in the 1985-86 period be translated as soon as your freeways come on stream and you have other measures taken into this high-performance express bus system that we're speaking about. Then you continue with that system. Ultimately out here, if some of these very substantial estimates of growth and so on, which we find somewhat unrealistic, occur, you can always resort to another system. Now, among these options, of course, there is the option of the 3-line rail underground system, and that is before the government and should remain before, and we are not rejecting that. We are putting this on a comparative basis. We're in effect saying an improved bus system should go with that, obviously, and the principles that we're suggesting might be included with it. Now we have several other categories: the limited underground rail systems with an express bus system, and there are various configurations of that which give better distribution characteristics and other aspects, but the basic point is that they are, in our view, very cost-effective and they do the job. We also suggested that there be reconsideration of the concept of elevated systems. Everybody's used to thinking of the 3rd Avenue L or the Chicago system or something else. In fact, today there are many ways, proper ways, to integrate elevated structures into cityscape and perform very positive functions in that regard. So we have, in fact, suggested 3 versions of this with various distribution system characteristics. Finally, we included here, just as an example, a description of the possible people mover systems, as an example of other technologies that can be reviewed within the time span we're discussing. Now, going back to these limited rail systems, I'll show you very briefly on this chart just one fundamental fact. Compared to the cost, estimated capital cost of the main system, these various systems are 1/2 or less of the cost of that system, and they carry the passengers, and they certainly have substantial indications of economic viability. So there are choices among options, and these are ranked and rated fundamentally from an economic and other points of view. There are other considerations, but those are the fundamental options that we have now presented to the government as we were asked. Now, in the course of our work, since the transportation system should be designed to serve urban development objectives and processes, we have also made several observations about the projections and the directions of urban growth and development that are evidently being planned for Singapore. We have urged the consideration of several possible approaches to achieving greater population and employment balance, and by this means reducing transportation requirements and the burdens on urban travelers. And possible ways have been suggested by us without restricting the growth and dynamism of the Singapore economy, to distribute the growth that you seek in a manner to enhance Singapore's livability, attractiveness, and economic viability. We are not anti-growth in this regard. We are urging another look at the direction and the form of growth, and the transportation system that is designed should support and assist in that process. Now, there are many other meritorious options in urban development strategy, just as there are options in this area. My final point is simply this: as you discuss the viability or the efficacy or the possible manageability of these various systems we're talking about, especially the all-bus system, we observe that Singapore is outstanding in the world in its application of enlightened principles of urban development and urban transportation. There is just no question about that. And these are principles which relate fundamentally to according street space to people rather than vehicles, to according safety and convenience to pedestrians, and to charging for the use of public resources on the basis of the use to which they're put. Now, if you persist, and we're certain that you will, in those principles, and would certainly urge you to do so, we think that you can solve these problems. It isn't only hardware that solves problems of transportation. It is the principles that you apply to your urban life.
Ken, I think we have just heard Ken broadly outlining the rationales of his proposal for an all-bus system, emphasizing that there is no assumption or constraint on the urban development. I hope later we have a chance to look at your concept of the express system and also maybe the exchange system.
Yes.
But before that, could we ask the Wildermuth team, starting with Bud, to talk to us about your thinking on the public transportation system?
To give a bit of background, the work that we undertook between 1972 and 1976 was simply stated to compare the merits of alternative systems on some common ground basis. In this evaluation, which was completed in 1976, we felt that the bus rail system was shown to yield higher benefits to Singapore than the all-bus system. This did not imply, of course, that the bus rail system would not require a substantial financial commitment. Benefits were compared on common grounds. The measurements and the analytical procedures which were used had been accepted widely as applicable to urban transportation, and I understand that Mr. Hansen has acknowledged that these evaluation procedures basically are the same ones that he would agree to employ. Our firm has never said that the all-bus system would not work. We have never in any of our reports predicted a doomsday, as has been implied. What we said, in fact, was that its operating conditions, even with the assumed Phase 2 express bus services and planned improvements on roads and expressways, will yield congestion cost and disbenefits to commuters, which would be greatly reduced by implementing a bus MRT combination system. Our bus system assumed the full expressway system that Singapore has now in the planning, design, and construction stages by 1992. Mr. Hansen, I believe, has assumed in his team's work the same operating system for express service. It is the implicit assumptions, Mr. Moderator, made on many of the operating details in the Hansen team report that we take issue with and disagree on. And perhaps there'll be some way to get meeting of the minds on clarifications. The MRT developed in the Phase 2 report was optimally located to serve the jobs and homes of Singaporeans. The alignment was adjusted during the course of the study to achieve a desired pattern that would have reduced the amount of transfers from feeder service and enable a large number of walk-in patrons. In fact, 57% of Singapore's 1992 population would reside within 1 mile of the MRT lines. Likewise, 53% of the employment or job locations in Singapore would be within 1 kilometer of the MRT line. The Hansen team report has made reference to the possibilities of using people mover systems, such as in Los Angeles specifically. We feel that this system, which has a limited capacity of 3,500 passengers per hour, is not suitable for the heavy transport demands in Singapore. There are other factors also that can be explored later. Reference was made to an elevated rail system, and of course, these items were studied and discussed during the phase 1 of the program. The steering committee made the policy decisions of looking at these as alternatives and chose the underground section to be about 1/3, about 15 kilometers of the total system to be underground. Now the illustration of the map behind me shows the proposed system. The MRT alignment is shown in the blue band, running from Bedok on the east through the central area to Jurong on the west. And the north-south segment runs from the central area north through Ang Mon Kio. What is shown in the orange lines are the Singapore Expressway system that is under construction and final design segments today. In certain parts, such as central area, is still under preliminary studies. But it shows the East Coast Parkway, the Pan Island Expressway, the Jurong Expressway, the Central Area Expressway, routes expressways up to Woodlands, and expressways through Ang Mo Kio up to Woodlands to join there. The total system of bus rail is shown here. When all bus was compared with bus rail, we deleted the blue line and therefore took out the MRT. So that was the basis of the comparisons. Mr. Wildermuth has a few comments that he'd like to make concerning the findings of our work and how we evaluate the situation.
In a few minutes, can you sketch out your thinking on this?
Well, perhaps taking off where Bart left off, we could say that the MRT system, as proposed, did in fact carry only 25% of the people who would board a public transport vehicle. However, it did carry 36% of the public transport travel in terms of passenger kilometers, considerably more than the 25%. As was mentioned before, 54% of all rail trips would be walk-in, walk-off. That is, people could walk from their home to the rail station. They could ride the train, get off, and walk to their job. A further 38% would require only one transfer. That is, they would use a bus either at the start of their journey or at the end of their journey. People could travel on the system at an average of 45 kilometers per hour. Not very fast, but considerably faster than they can travel today in buses, and considerably more greater comfort in that it's a smooth ride on a rail system. These are some of the things that perhaps should be said, and in fact, just to give a few more indications, this is what a typical station would be looking like, where passengers can wait in comfort, not exposed to the elements. Now, there were also a number of other sections planned with elevated sections and elevated stations, such as this one, which is the one proposed for Clementi Newtown. It is our main concern in the analysis that was done by Mr. Hansen's team that we feel some lack of concern for the consumer. And these are some of the points that we have been very critical about. The fact that large concentrations of people are expected to be boarding buses on curbsides, that such large concentrations would require all sorts of arrangements, barriers, and certainly would take a lot of space to be concentrated along the curbsides. In fact, it's quite clear that on the heavy stops, not only would we require a lot more pavement space than we have there today, but we would have to have dual bus lanes so that the buses could easily pull in and out. This, of course, would affect the general capacity of the road system, despite the fact that the claim was made, and I would like to quote, "The all-bus system would provide a dramatic increase in travel speeds and greatly alleviate the central street capacity problem."
Bruno, can we ask Ken or John whether they want to add something on the concept of the all-bus system? Go for some discussion first before we carry on.
Yeah, I think there are a couple issues that are worth commenting on, and it really has to do with the design of the express bus system, which is one of the key issues that we're concerned with. And there are really two aspects of that problem I think we need to address. The first of these is Mr. Wildermuth has referred to as the large volumes, the large numbers of people who will board the buses at particular points within the central area. His assessment lists one estimate, I believe, of 8,000 boardings in the Robinson Road corridor. And we have a display here that this express bus route runs from the Badak terminal to the East Coast Parkway and then up onto Robinson and Keppel Road. As you can see, it has 1, 2, 3, 4 stops in the central area. Actually, it's a PM peak route, and so the way we envision this operating is the bus would begin at this first point, go to 2, 3, 4, then nonstop to the Badak terminal. What's shown at the Badak terminal is a feeder for this Badak terminal. Now, at issue here is how you would go about handling the roughly 2,282 persons who would board these 4 stops during the peak hour. As I say, that's the boardings, estimated boardings in 1992 for the Badak service. What's important to understand is that there are 11 services that serve Robinson Road. One of the observations was that there was no allowance for unloading passengers on this system. That's absolutely incorrect. We've used the rather conventional measure of 1.6 seconds per passenger unloading, which is in fact conservative given the nature of the system that we have in mind, particularly the intention to collect fares at the Badak terminal and possibly to use platform boarding and certainly to use two double-door buses. The way the calculations are done is there's 1.6 seconds for each boarding passenger. The links connecting these nodes each assume 30 kilometers per hour speeds, so that you board, say, as an example here, and I'll come back to this, 1/4 of the passengers at node 1 here. You then proceed at 30 kilometers an hour to node 2, board another 1/4, 30 kilometers an hour, and so on. Until you get to the East Coast Parkway, we assume that on the East Coast Parkway, you can proceed at 60 kilometers per hour. You leave the East Coast Parkway then and can manage 40 kilometers per hour into the Badak terminal. Now, what's important about this concept is the fact that the buses make so few stops. And in particular, something like only 17% of the kilometers on this service are done in the central area, 73% on the East Coast Parkway, and only 9% getting off the Parkway to the Badak terminal. Now, as I say, there are a number of problems with this. One of the problems has to do with the number of passengers that board at each of these stops. And if you look at number 4 here, we have something like 1,200 passengers boarding, which translates into something like...
Do you have a diagram showing?
No, I don't, but I have a number. Translates into, I believe it is 13 buses that would operate in 4. This illustrates the basic principles of this operation. Because something like half of all the boardings occur at this node 4, it would be in fact possible to divide this service into 2 services. One of them would in fact have around 12 buses and would proceed from node 4 to the dock terminal. The second service would serve the other 3 nodes and would again proceed directly to the dock terminal. So to sum up, and I'm sorry I've taken so long, the principles are, first, high speeds on each of these links that arise because we don't have congestion interference, and in particular because by segregating the links, we can operate as many services as turn out to be economical. That is as many services as can be used at 10-minute headways. That, I think, will give you a little bit of idea of this.
Thank you, John. I think perhaps at this stage, it's my intention that we have a pretty good overview of what the two groups of consultants are talking about. Both the panels and the viewers have some rough ideas. So I would like to let the panels to raise some questions first. I thought perhaps we'll start with Bao because you're from the bus service, Singapore bus service.
Yes, thank you, Taika. I think first of all, I would like to make the point that conceptually, there is really nothing wrong or new about the express services that is, I believe, the mainstay of the all-bus system that you have proposed. There are small differences, the main ones being that your buses travel on expressways, ours don't. The simple reason is because expressways do not exist at the moment. But as I said, we agree with the concept of an express bus service, and in fact, we are implementing these services since '75, and we keep on doing this now. So my initial reaction to the figures that came out in your report, the fact that we needed only 2,700 buses in 1992, and knowing that today we operate 2,400 buses, so when I saw that, according to those figures, we only needed 300 more buses in 10 years' time, and yet providing a level of service which is claimed to be comparable to the MRT in terms of traveling time, comfort, convenience, and so on. Initial reaction was, why are we talking about an MRT? Unfortunately, in going into the details, we found quite a number of questions which to us are important ones and which we would like to see clarification on. Because it is these details, from these details, we arrive at those figures that I was talking about earlier, those figures which to us sounded very optimistic. So, if I may, I would like to go through a few of these and seek some clarification from you. The first one is regarding operating speeds. Now, you have explained to us earlier and tonight regarding the use, the fact that the speeds were much higher because there's less congestion and that you're using expressways and so on. Even allowing for that fact, the figures that you are postulating and that you think that the buses can run in 1992 are much, much higher than what we feel are either reasonable speeds or safe speeds. In fact, the differences are large enough for us to question whether there has been any empirical studies done to show that these speeds are attainable. Let me give you an example. Feeder services in new towns, you postulate 40 or 39 kilometers per hour. We are averaging 15 to 20 kilometers per hour. So there is a difference of 2 or 3 times. What we are wondering is, how is the situation going to change in 10 years' time in new towns, such that we can operate twice or even 3 times as fast? There's not going to be any expressways built. In fact, the congestion may be even worse. So that is a very important question for us, because if you can run faster, then obviously you need less buses. Our second point of clarification is the number of point-to-point express services. As I said earlier, we are not against the concept of point-to-point express services, but I get the impression in the report that you are gathering people from further away than is necessary in order to justify point-to-point expresses to the amount which you are indicating in your report. So, the effect of this really means that more people are being made to transfer unnecessarily. I hope that this is not the case, and I would like to seek clarification.
Yes, I'd like to elaborate where Mabutan left off about speeds and assumed speeds in the 1992 road network. Although on that map there you see a very elaborate, comparatively elaborate network of expressways for 1992 on a very relatively small island, our travel forecasts show that many of these expressways will be very heavily loaded in 1992. Although some of them are built up to dual 4 lanes. In other words, 4 traffic lanes in each direction. Now, I have my doubts on the ability of express buses on expressways ever attaining average overall speeds that the Hansen team has assumed. We have in traffic engineering terms what we call a level of service. As the number of vehicles along the expressway increase, and we are talking of peak hour conditions, traffic speeds will drop. Ability to maneuver will drop. And my judgment is, looking at the kind of forecast volumes that we have on the expressways, it will be extremely difficult to have an expressway bus attaining an average overall speeds of even 50 kilometers per hour. Unless, of course, very drastic traffic management measures are implemented on the expressways, things like ram metering or some form of toll that the team has suggested. Now, this has got some other drawbacks. It means that other road users will be affected. It also means that these people who are affected will be diverted to the local road system, and in the process congesting our local road system. Now, much of the road users for the expressways are not just cars alone. We have a growing economy, and our forecast for truck traffic, for instance, is considerable. And we surely don't want all these to get onto the road system. So, in short, I would summarize, I have grave doubts on the assumed speeds that the Hansen team has assumed in their...
Well, if I could start this, because I think contexts are important, and then John, I know, is anxious to get at some of the other questions. You know, it's important to do as the last parts of your questions have done, which is to look squarely at 1992 questions, because if you compare from today, just looking out your window, it's not a very good comparison, and it's not a very good judgment that could be made. Comparing 2,400 buses now versus our description of 2,700 buses is not a correct comparison. You know the buses that you now have, and we're telling you the buses of 1992 that are depicted in this model are 94-passenger, modern, air-conditioned buses with the kind of attributes that buses in 1992 will have, certainly in terms of their ability to speed, their better ability to brake, or whatever else it may be. To speak of trying express routes now, when in fact you're not doing the express routes on freeways, is not to say that the express system that we're describing for 1992 is tried. So I really just suggest that, you know, we always see the image in front of us of what we have. Unfortunately, analytically, we're talking about numbers and actions and things out in 1992. And I think the questions that these subordinate questions you've asked are essentially addressed to that, and that's what we, in fact, have been analyzing and are better able to respond. The other comparisons are not basically valid. We're talking about a dynamically changed, a radically changed bus system from what is existing today.
Excuse me, I don't see the difference. I think Mabotan said we have a system at the moment. You are saying let's have a high-performance bus service.
Yes.
And you are saying that between now and 1992, things will change. What will change? Because as I understand it, it takes a lead time of 5 maybe more years to build an expressway, arterial road system. And it's 10 years from now. We've got to know what they are now for 1992.
I think that's a good question, Mr. Wong, and we're saying, as we understand the building of the expressways, you will be essentially on stream with your expressways about 1986, right? So they will be available and they will have been used, and there will be various measures to restrain or use them and so on by 1992, which is when we put these numbers of vehicles on them. When we're talking about other aspects of it, there are those changes. There are the potential of measures to control the speeds of vehicles or the numbers that go on them. You're going to have to make those decisions regardless.
True. This is the what. Yes. This is your luxury is that you give us options. Our difficulty is that we have to make those decisions, and therefore, Milton will certainly not be happy if all the motorists in Singapore were denied the expressway or to pay a toll on it to get on the ramp or whatever. Yeah. But the point I'm trying to make is that because the highways are going to be ready, expressways are going to be ready by 1986, we've got to know what they are now for 1992. But Joseph says it just can't be done. Is it what you're saying, Joseph?
I think what I have said was we will get this network of expressways by 1992 because it has been forecasted.
Right.
We require such a network.
Can you get such speeds, sir?
Yeah, this is where I express my doubts. The speeds on the network of expressways shown in red on the plan there. To get the whole network ready, available for use is one thing. To be able to have the buses, modern as they are, to attain those speeds during a peak hour condition, I think is something else.
The speed issue, again, we're at the nub of it again. I think there are at least a couple observations on that. One of them is that we've stressed the importance of allocating space appropriately as among the various users. And this is an extensive expressway network in 1992. We believe that there is space for buses on it. We believe that there's space at 60 kilometers per hour, as we suggest. And in our sensitivity analysis, if Mr. Yi is right, we'll give him 45 kilometers per hour. But the point is that these roads are for the use of all the citizens and not just for the use of automobiles and trucks. And so it is a question of allocation as well as a question of design. If the roads are improperly designed so that they cannot maintain those kinds of speeds, that's an important issue and ought to be taken into account. The impressions we've received, the briefings we've received on the expressway system indicates that it's a very generous one given the projected growth of traffic between now and 1992. But that's a very, very important and serious issue. On the question of the feeders...
Maybe, John, yeah. I think at this point I would like to see, so far, what kind of image do you think, Tianzi, you see, and maybe later I'll move on to ask Milton to see what kind of question you may ask from a motorist point of view.
Well, in a sense, what I'm going to say also affects Milton, because I'm looking at it from the viewpoint of road users. I agree that, we are designing so far with things like the ALS, a scheme where we sort of tell people that there are priorities. Now, as I understand it, the express bus system depends on our telling people even more that priorities have to be pushed even further. In other words, the pedestrian, the bus commuter comes first. The truck driver, and perhaps, well, the vehicle owner, the car driver, he'll have to wait a while. Now, the point that I'm asking here is then, under those circumstances, to what extent can the car driver, the non-bus commuter, bear the cost? Because the cost will be very, very high. They are going to get higher. Okay, we are the only country in the world that has experimented with a system that has gone as far as we have gone. But that this is linked back with the issue of votes and cost. Because if cost gets very high for the car driver, what is the impact? What is the final impact on what he will do with his feet? Will he decide to keep himself in the car, or will he switch to a bus? In fact, if I push Mr. Hansen's point to the end, right through to the end, it seems almost logical to say, look, let's go to the extreme end and forget about car driving. Let's tell everybody, unless it's really essential, don't get on a car. not at peak periods anyway. And let's just concentrate on taking buses. Now the point about that is if you draw the issue to the end, then it's going to hurt. At some point, something gives.
When you look at the MRT rail system, what you buy with that, the thing which I found striking, and I don't have these data handy, they're really in the LUTPR and Phase 2 report, is that what you really buy with the limited rail system is additional capacity for cars. The way to think about it is that you take Robinson Road. The way to think about it is what you do is you add a lane of vehicle traffic, a lane of automobiles in each direction on Robinson Road. That's the corridor that the backbone system goes down. And the question is, what is that worth? How much do you lose in terms of diversion? How much is the cost of that extra capacity? And is there some additional or better way to provide that capacity? Our feeling is that you don't lose very much by giving more road space to buses. We're talking about any place from 1 to 2 lanes in each direction, and that you would pay an exorbitant price to add to capacity of the central area through the rail MRT. Our sense is that the amount of central area capacity, both road and rail, is just enormous and increasing very, very rapidly.
But this argument clearly leaves out the concern for the public transport traveler, who with a rail system would get a better public transport system. He'd have a more convenient system, he'd have more convenient riding, he'd have faster, smoother riding, he would have a much more opportunity to walk from his home to a reliable system that runs very frequently at 2.5 minutes as the trains are scheduled during the peak, and would get to is close enough within his destination that he can walk from there to his destination. So he has no worries about getting to work or getting back home because the system does operate on its own right away. It is not subject to any kind of traffic conditions, is not subject of somewhere a traffic light breaking down and you have a 2-hour jam like we had the other day. These things, I think, are important too, because as you go on, as you have a population that acquires higher skills, higher income levels, I believe they are entitled to expect perhaps something more from their public transport system than what they have today.
Let Newton have a word, because...
Thank you, Mr. Kain, for saying that the roads are for all of us. Reading through your report, I thought the roads were only for the buses. Then, sir, also I must thank you for putting the motorist point of view. As I said many times, the Singaporeans' love affair with a car can never be broken. It's the young man's joy and the old man's darling. Looking at your proposal of fast express bus, I would go with it if we had all this expressway existing. But if we have all this expressway existing, then surely the car can go on it. We can come into the central area as easily, and if you can build a little more car park for us, we can park our cars, and we can come in with the buses. But as Bruno has stated, that with the population growth, we expect more vehicles, and of course, if we have this, then I feel that the MRT is the answer.
I think many of these points are well taken. We're not saying that MRTs are not convenient, useful additions to the capacity. Among the alternatives we've set up here, we have in fact indicated the various alternatives. We have done a comparative cost evaluation. If you have the money here in Singapore, you can start building an MRT tomorrow. That isn't the basic question. We weren't asked whether you should. We were asked whether you needed to, whether there are alternatives, where are there less expensive ways to do it, and where, in fact, you can do it in a conceivable way. Now, let's get to the issue of the automobile. We stated, and we've stated tonight again, that if you apply what we consider, and you clearly, apparently consider, to be equitable principles of use of urban resources for the welfare of people, you are going to make various decisions about who shall have a share of those resources. And that goes for your road space as well. Now, If you apply those principles, you will clearly apply those principles, and I'm not trying to leave out trucks, but I'm trying to keep the problem a little more simple so we don't start with this slide rule business. You basically have a truck, a bus that has something on the order of 50, maybe 95 passengers going on that space, and you have an automobile that may even have 5 passengers going on space as well, and they use relatively different space to park in the community as well. Now, if you apply the principle, at least insofar as people are concerned, that it's people and not vehicles that have the access or have the rights or who pay the taxes and what have you, fundamentally you will come up with a reasonable allocation of this road space for those purposes. We do consider that having invested in these great freeways, and you're making a very substantial investment, you ought to use them and get the real value out of them, and that's not to go the speed you go on arterials, but in fact to go faster, to give better access to automobiles and to buses to the central area and everywhere else that they can reach. I do not like Mr. Toe to be pushed to an extreme, because this is where we get these doomsday scenarios that force us into decisions that sometimes aren't very wise. There is not that type of problem here. We're not running out of space. Your population is not growing that fast, and your population is going to taper off at a reasonable point as well, and there is a limit.
I think it's very difficult maybe tonight to come to resolution on this. I would like to ask Bill, maybe from the architectural environmental angle, you have some comments?
Thank you. The bus system that the Hansen team proposes is not as clear. It would perhaps have congestion at the peak hours. It would require large bus depots in the city area to load people, and it would perhaps less convenient during peak hours. And my question is that whether one could consider the slightly more luxurious and therefore comfortable system, bearing in mind the environmental impact of the elevated railway coming all the way from Changi, or possibly just from Bedok over to Jurong, where you have the rail in front of the flats over the existing roads, as compared to buses which are less protruding into the environment, which are perhaps easier to overcome its pollution problems, which are perhaps less difficult to handle in terms of its better flexibility. I'd like the teams to comment on the environmental impact of their systems.
Maybe we'll start with...
Certainly. To add one thing to what Bill has said, the combination system bill does include express bus service on the expressways in the appropriate corridors in addition to the MRT. The matter of the detailed examination of environmental amenities as affected by one all-bus system and the bus rail system were not measured, you might say, in explicit terms during the course of the evaluation, but judgmental values were placed on this on the basis of experience elsewhere. And certainly the air pollution would be one major concern in the heavy corridors with when you go to such things as the dual bus lanes and the stops even at 30 kilometers between stops, if it could be attained. But the stopping and starting, the additional exhaust and the various elements put into the atmosphere as compared with a bus rail system. Certainly I think that the air pollution would be lessened. Noise pollution would also, in our view, be lessened, especially in the congested central area where the facility is underground and is taken away from the dBA levels are certainly lessened by having it in that location.
Kenneth?
Well, I think my response, Bill, is relatively simple, and that is that obviously these factors can be taken into account, and there are pluses and minuses. The fact that an MRT system, in fact, is elevated or at grade for a long period of time, sometimes in very sensitive areas, sometimes in less sensitive areas. The fact that if you put a lot of passengers underground in an MRT system, you have more automobiles out on the road, and they are not necessarily pollutionless or without visual intrusion or without noise. So you're going to have certain levels, and the trade-offs here are there. Now, when you get down to hard cases, there should be, obviously, an evaluation, to a certain extent quantitative, and obviously to a considerable extent subjective and judgmental and professional judgments and what have you, as you've described. And that's standard to these kinds of detailed choices. Now, we have clearly not made that. We did feel that, in fact, the larger amount of elevation on one of the alternative or MRT approaches ought to be examined further. We asked for Professor McHugh, one of your colleagues from the Dean of the School of Design at Harvard, to come over and give a view as to what possible alignment and what possible aspects of this may be. That was a judgment call. And he said, I see some very positive urban development elements here with potentially offsetting features to visual pollution, what have you. No question, these are very important, but there are pluses and minuses, and you've got to work it out in each particular case.
Nanjang has a question. Yeah.
True to the penny-pinching image of those in my profession, the all-bus system obviously strikes us a very sympathetic chord in terms of financing costs and monetary requirements. And the heavy mass rapid transit system that goes totally underground will obviously send cold shudders down our spines if we think in terms of a $4 billion cost on December 79 prices. And I've heard the figure of $7 to $8 billion in 1982, at current prices. And assuming you use a debt service cost of, say, 8%, or capital cost of 8%, that's $560 million right off the bat, between $560 to $640 million per annum. That obviously is a very high price for us to pay for, I believe, 25% of the commuting traffic, and for the kind of rights that we talk about, Milton and Tienza. So I think we are really essentially faced with this choice. Again, on the one hand, I think Bhutan's SBS can take care of its own capital requirements, whether you buy double-deckers or articulated buses or whatever you call them. Somehow the SBS is able to finance its own requirements because the unit costs are much less, forgetting the fact that for a moment that the roads are a very major cost. So now if we sort of match the total underground versus the roads, I think it's still the expressway. I still think that it's still a very high cost. What I would like to hear from you, Bud, is in your experience, and I believe you all have experiences in Washington, in San Francisco, as to how the financing or the servicing of capital costs in these areas have been, and how would you have some ideas and insights on how we could do it, other than the fact that the government dishes out the whole $4 billion or $7 billion and say, here, but have fun.
Well, Nanjang, the figure of $4 billion, I think I heard for the first time after I arrived in Singapore this trip. Similarly, 7 to 8 billion was the first time I had heard it when I was here this time. The capital cost estimate of the Phase 3 study, I believe, in this report is about 2.9 billion.
Current cost, current day prices.
This 3.2, isn't it?
No, it's 3.2.
That's for this system here. That's for this system here, not for the extensions. The extensions were also studied in Phase 3. 3.2. But it was also indicated in a in the analysis we did on the basis of the cost of 75, that if a capital contribution was made by the government in the order of $45 million.
Million.
45 million.
45 million.
45 million as a cash contribution. Say if an authority was set up, a provisional authority, and a cash contribution of 45 million was made, then with a fare structure that gave about the equal fare from MRTs to buses, the system would pay off its capital debt and would pay its operating and maintenance cost. Now that was the figures that I have heard this time. When you go up to $7 to $8 billion, it was mentioned by one officer of government of a cash contribution of $700 million as one contribution. That man related that to the annual PWD budget for roads in the order of about a third of that each year. So that's the kind of contributions. Now these were the figures that were thrown out. Now if you go back to the United States situation in Washington and San Francisco and others, certainly in addition to Bruno, Ken and John are well aware of, we have a program in our federal government, the Urban Mass Transportation Administration, of the capitalization and operating and maintenance contributions in the order of 80%. That, I don't believe, was in existence at the time of the San Francisco. Yes. Totally it was, but maybe... No,
it came in
later on, but the initial was through...
It's there now, and operating costs.
Yeah, but at the time of the initial construction, a lot of it was based upon voter referendum through their ad valorem and other taxation base. They voted it in. They wanted to have it, and they were willing to be taxed to pay for it.
Mr. Chairman, may I put a bit in on this capital, too, because I think, I'm not going to argue, but put the point to you. In the comparative analysis that we've done, we've used the capital costs that were developed by these gentlemen and that were developed by the Phase 3, and we've compared it against that. And that, incidentally, is all discounted against inflation. That point's always been thrown around. We haven't made up any of these figures ourselves. None of the 4 billion, 8 billion figures are ours. We have said, and we'll say again, that when you start going underground as they plan there are risks, there are imponderables. Each study you do gets it a little more finite and what have you. And your government, we hope, will evaluate those risks. When it comes, however, to other questions like this, the earlier evaluations were, in fact, done on a benefit-cost calculation, which we said earlier, is the standard methodology, and it comes out that way. Now, there were disputes about a number of those matters with regard to that particular system. The World Bank sent a team over here and said very clearly to your government, we think that the capital costs of the MRT system are underestimated by at least 30%, and that the operating costs of the alternative bus system that you're comparing are overestimated by about 20%. Now, the World Bank then said, we think you ought to go bust because the benefit-cost ratio and this comparison comes out quite negative in this regard. Now, since that dialogue went on, there has been, in fact, the Phase 3, which identified additional add-ons, modified things, and so on. So the capital costs increase. And I'm not talking about inflationary increases. You keep telling us there and there, and we're not talking about it. There is a later year, but that's what we're comparing to. We're not comparing an earlier 75 bus against a 79 cost MRT or anything like that. My final point, sir, unlike the United States, where individual communities can get, in effect, money given by their other citizens who never use their systems to help it, you have no fairy godfather here in Singapore to give it to you. It's coming out of the pocket of every citizen. You ought to have the whole benefit of all the money you spend on transportation. And we've suggested by this report, you should look very hard and you should look at options. And if you feel that you can afford a much more elaborate system that has all these attributes that people like to speak, then you do that now and you do without something now. When you're richer in the future, and you will, and I'm sure you will be, you can afford a more elaborate system better too, remember. So those are the decisions you have to make. Sorry.
I would like Bruno and Baotan just briefly.
Okay, I'd like to respond first of all to the comments about the World Bank's critical assessment of the costs, both the construction costs and the bus operating costs. We have, since that time, a new cost estimate by a totally different consultant group that has attempted to make a comparison between the original cost estimate, which was criticized as being too low, and their current cost estimate, 1979 prices. Now, in order to do that, they had to assume some rate of inflation in the construction industry because they were working with 1979 prices. They had assumed 7% for that inflation. Based on that assumption, they showed that the previous cost estimate was 20% too low. Now, we have gone back and checked what the inflation in the construction industry actually was compared to the assumption of 7%. We have found that the Housing Board experienced over that same period an inflation rate of 9.5%. At Changi International Airport, the inflation rate experienced for the same period was 11%. Now, if you plug in those 9.5% or 11% instead of the 7%, you would find that the previous cost estimate was very close to what the current cost estimate is, done by totally different consultants. That's the point on the construction.
No,
the
I'm
World
sorry,
Bank
that isn't
was
correct.
also...
There are add-ons in that cost, and that's
let me finish, please.
Okay.
The World Bank was also critical of the bus operating costs.
Yes.
Now, we've had an opportunity again to compare what's actually happened to bus operating costs. I have gotten very detailed financial statements from Mr. Ma's bus company, and they show clearly that bus costs today are 24% higher in 1975 dollars than what we had estimated they would be for 1982. If we actually go back and correct for the income change, the salary increases that were built into the estimate, we find that the difference between our estimate then and what the costs are now expressed in those $75 is 27% more. Now, if the World Bank wants to continue to say that we underestimated the operating costs in light of actual experience experienced by SPS, then, you know, that's their
Maybe let's hear
prerogative.
what its SPS experience.
Well, I supplied those figures to Bruno, so they are correct. But I don't want to go into this question of whether the costs are underestimated, overestimated, or what. I would just like to make this point. It is an accepted fact, I think, that the capital cost for the all-bus system will be lower than the capital cost for the underground. But my question is this: are we being told that we are actually paying more for the underground and getting the same kind of service that we would get if we were to pay less with an all-bus? Are we being told that we are actually buying the same product but paying more on the one hand and paying less on the other? Or are we being told that you pay a little bit more, you get a better product, you pay a little bit less, you get a not so good product? I get the impression that we are being told that the all-bus system is providing a comparable service in terms of speed, comfort, and convenience to the MRT. So I think this is one point I would like clarified.
You know, the discussion on the various costs, I think the question is put very fairly in this regard. And the decision as between those as to which you choose to pay in terms of what benefits you see, you're going to be assisted to a certain or to a considerable extent by what we call a formal cost-benefit evaluation of the type you've had. And you certainly have to do that once again, and it'll take a little time, but it doesn't take all that much time. The problem, though, is that we feel that you ought to, in effect, take another step to look at this alternative bus system. One of the most important things, we think, is to dispel this view that you're going up to the edge of a cliff and you're going to fall off. Now, just don't believe that don't believe that if anybody tells you. You have enough ability, you have enough notice, you have enough ways to respond. If we were wrong, which we don't believe we are, about the principles of this bus system we've described here, and what it will do, and the fact that it will be equivalent in its fundamentals. And we're not going to argue whether the cushions are softer in an MRT versus a bus. That's a subjective matter, and you can argue endlessly on it. But the basic essentials of service, convenience, and reliability, we think are achievable with all of these things working in combination. Now, then you have to choose what you're going to do, and you choose that in two contexts. One in terms of among these choices, and the other is in terms of what else you might spend on in Singapore that you would like to use that money for. And this is the essential test. But we think that there is not this cataclysmic climate in which it must be done. If you do have to do some additional studies, it's to bring things up to date so you can do these calculations and get a clear choice, and then look at the matters that are really related to the financing and what you want to pay. Look at the subjective matters that fundamentally make your choice on the other aspects of this, and then go ahead. But I think that the basic fact is that you have been under a number of wrong impressions. A, about what might happen in the future. B, about the limits of choice that you had. And if that's been illuminated by this discussion, we think we've performed at least that. We happen to think, in addition, that we're quite right about what we've said, and we put that to the test. It's public, it's there, we stand on it.
But would you like to...
Thank you.